How much can changing a single number impact the course of a game? In this video, we'll find out that adding or subtracting a single number in a single point can make or break a game. I've talked about Project Eisenhower before, and you can find the video at this tag, but it's important for me to establish a quick definitive overview of the project and its aims. So Project Eisenhower is a dudes on a map wargame primarily about logistics. Logistics meaning supply lines, rails. Basically, if an army marches on its stomach, then how do you get the food so that the army can march? And then how do you get that food to the army itself? Logistics is the emphasis because logistics is the core of warfare. Amateurs think about tactics, professionals think about logistics. The design has three core aims. The first is to have a high potential for interaction while keeping the emphasis on the player's own war machine. That means rails and supply networks, food and supplies, think like gas, stuff like that, as well as the technology, the core infrastructure, as well as the institutional knowledge that a faction would have and build on. The second is to have a pace of play that's built around quick turns. I really don't want players to be taking 30 minutes when it's their turn to play. Rather, I want small decisions made each turn that will ultimately build up into a singular turn that has a high impact before going back to those slow building moves. Finally, I want to maintain a simple to understand rule set that can be taught in 5 minutes and contained on a single page. In my game about wartime logistics, it's important to properly simulate an army's need to eat. For this purpose, I have two game objects that work in tandem with. The Rest and Relaxation card is the mode by which the player returns all of the cards they've played throughout the game. Once they have only the Rest and Relaxation card, they play the card, they pay a cost, and return all of the cards they've played to their hand to be played again. The Victory and Feeding track serves a dual purpose. The first is to show how close each player is to winning, but alongside that, it dictates how many rations you need to feed each soldier. As you get closer to victory, the more rations are required of each city you control. I felt this track was innocuous at first, a way to keep the game dynamic as it progressed. However, over the course of 2 playtests, I learned just how vital each number on this track really was. During the first playtest, the game's pace was much more slow and plodding than I expected. Individual turns were fast, but the players never had a real opportunity to get their engines beyond the point of just producing food. In fact, the game ended up looking a lot more like a feudal conflict than a 20th century industrial war. The winning player seized enough farmland in the center, amassed a massive engine of food, and then used it to march on victory points to secure a win. During this time, the other players were stuck in a loop of producing and consuming food without ever creating big enough gains to get out of that cycle. After this playtest, I made a singular change to the prototype. I reduced the amount that players had to feed if they held no victory points from 1 to 0. This single update fundamentally changed the way players approached the game. The players were able to quickly leave that loop and get to the point where they were producing enough food to where they were reliably able to feed their troops and do other things. Building the infrastructure, namely the trains and supply lines, took a much heavier emphasis as players began by going around capital cities, and then once they felt they were strong enough, gained those capital cities to get the large resources that they provided. Finally, the end game was a lot more dynamic. One player had been steadily building, and another player had been building around capital cities, keeping kind of a insurgency force until they were ready to move on the capital cities. A good idea is something that does not solve just one single problem, but rather can solve multiple problems at once. There are 3 big changes I'm going to make for the next iteration of Eisenhower. The first is a big one. Right now, I'm using 4 types of resource cubes: yellow, red, green, and brown. Yellow represents supplies, red represents military power, green represents capital assets, and brown represents military bases. I'm planning on removing the red cubes altogether and replacing them with player-specific meeples. Meeples will represent military strength, as well as create something that the player must feed. With this, I can take out control markers altogether. One of the things about control markers is there's a lot of weird things that come from them. First, they're fiddly without actually adding any meaningful mechanical aspects. A meeple will show that there's soldiers here and I control it. One of the things about feeding things is I no longer have to feed cities, and instead I just have to feed troops. Therefore, if I have troops en route in the middle of a rail, they still need to be fed, whereas before, you could kind of squirrel away your resources on rails between feeding, and I had to add an additional rule for that. This also really solves my combat issue. Before I had additional rules tacked onto red cubes for how they worked. Now I can remove that altogether and just have it be when your meeples run into other meeples, then it establishes control of a city. In other words, there's no fighting at all. Rather, the control of a city and its resources are dictated by the player who owns the most meeples. But when you go to feed your soldiers, if you can't feed a soldier, then you have to remove it from the table, which means that conflict will be about controlling the resources at a city and trying to starve out the opponent's meeples. Therefore, the integral rules of the game solves conflict without having to add additional concepts. The next big thing is a standing orders mechanic. Standing orders will be a resource that each of your bases will produce at the end of each of your turns. At the start of the game, this is going to be meeples. This way I can have an easy way to produce a lot of soldiers and thus allow the player to expand out and gain cities and thus resources. However, as the game goes on, you can replace and change your standing orders. So, for example, if you want your bases to produce food, you can change your standing orders to food. Or if you want to be aggressive, you can make it so that at the end of your turn you get to take an additional move action, and thus you can gain more territory. One of the issues that players had was they didn't feel like they were able to produce enough on their turns, and I'm really hoping that these standing orders are going to fix that. In addition, I really like the idea of a military-based strategy, but having that strategy within the cards that you pick up throughout the game adds more weight and complexity to those cards and makes it easier for players to ignore that strategy altogether. And so the standing orders will hopefully fix that issue, while also removing the need to have plan or side Bs to cards. Finally, I'm adding a rail track to each player mat. At the start of the game, you place all of your rails on your player mat, and throughout the game, as you place your rails, you get bonuses for getting more rails out there. Hopefully, this is something that will encourage players to interact with the rail mechanic, as well as give them different strategies and options. It's also a way to add more victory points to the game. This is something I was planning on always doing, but I wasn't quite ready at this stage to do it because I didn't want to expand the game with too many systems. Quickly, there are a number of things that I plan on adding to the game in the future, but not in this current iteration. These mechanics include minor, major, and hidden objectives. Minor and major being big things that everybody can achieve, and hidden being small objectives that only you can achieve and nobody else can see as you're trying to do them. I want to add a meeple track similar to the rail track, where the more meeples you get down, the more bonuses or penalties you take. And I want to add variable player powers. Additionally, I feel I'm quickly reaching the point where the map itself needs some major attention. As I've said before, it's largely based on Ticket to Ride, but we're getting to the point where that's not good enough. I need to take a major evaluation and say, what are the core ideas of the map? How can I really emphasize the different aspects and mechanics of the game using the map? However, that's going to take a ton of creative and practical effort, and I'm not quite ready to get to that point. Please take the time to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below. I'll try to respond to all of the comments you leave, so if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out there. Or if you are wondering why I didn't take a certain direction, I'd be happy to address that. Also, share this video with your friends and tune in a couple of weeks when I come out with the next video. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.